I'm acting alone. There's no one to back me up. I was absolutely sure of my judgments. There was no doubt in my mind that I had it right. I couldn't believe that no one else was speaking out as I was about to do.
Meanwhile, the invasion preparations rolled on. Invasion was just 2 weeks away.
Tuesday the 11th of March, the last bit of work I had to do was at 4:30 that afternoon in the National Intelligence Watch Office. The Director General, Kim Jones, was there convening the meeting. I went to my office and sent an email I had already drafted to half a dozen of my colleagues, basically saying, by the time you read this I'll be gone and you'll know why, and I'm sorry if this causes you any angst. I pressed send and I walked up with my resignation letter to Kim Jones' office. He said repeatedly, do you know the damage this will do? And I suppose he was talking about the damage to O&A, the damage to the government, maybe the damage to the country. I was lucky to make the news. I had to go via my ex-wife's home at Duntroon and feed the dogs. I only got home just in time.
Andrew Wilkie set off for work at ONA, the Office of National Assessments.
The story caused a furore. It was unheard of for someone in the intelligence community to come out, let alone to accuse the government of lying.
Iraq does not pose a serious enough security threat to the US or the UK or Australia or to any other country.
The government wasn't happy. They didn't like anyone questioning their policy on Iraq. Well, they're very sensitive about it. And this was a pretty serious bit of criticism, partly because Wilkie did have credibility, but also because the story made such a huge splash, and it worried them.
Just 24 hours earlier, it could have been illegal to even publish Wilkie's name. Now, he was lead story in the national media.
My plan was to do no media that night, and I figured there'd be a little bit of media interest the next morning.
But that's not the way it works. They wanted the details first-hand from the star whistleblower. Wilkie was now media property.
Minutes after me saying no to someone at the 7:30 report, the anchor, Kerry O'Brien, rings personally.
Have you been privy to top-level intelligence on areas like terrorism issues, on Afghanistan, on Iraq?
Yes.
Just 1.5 hours after the story broke, the government went on the attack.
National issues. The government's first response was to say, I didn't know what I was talking about.
The officer concerned was a member of our transnational issues branch. The transnational issue branch does not deal with issues related to Iraq.
I had not the slightest idea of how much media interest there would be. This is all just happening, just piling on top. Bang, 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 bang.
The government's response was swift. Having used Wilkie's old boss to say that he didn't know what he was talking about, they now changed tack.
A member of the Prime Minister's media staff worked the press gallery in Canberra telling people that because I had separated from my wife, I was mentally unstable and shouldn't be listened to. A typical organisational response.
You really are talking about no-holds-barred type reactions in terms of just what governments and organisations can be prepared to do to discredit somebody. It's open slather.
This snide little suggestion that because he was going through a marriage breakup, he was unstable. Well, there's nothing unstable about Andrew Wilkie. He was very calm, very steady sort of bloke, and I just spent 2 days with him. I knew he wasn't unstable.
As a whistleblower, Andrew Wilkie had done all the right things. He had resigned from his job in order to exercise his democratic rights to speak out. But that wouldn't save him from what was to come. He was about to get into a great deal of trouble. Andrew Wilkie had turned himself from secret intelligence officer to whistleblower on a matter of principle. He was about to become the first Australian casualty in the war with Iraq.
The day after I left O&A, and Laurie Oakes rang me to say, look, you know, there's someone working in the press gallery saying you're crazy. And not long after that, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Arthur Senadinos, rang me to say, oh, look, we've just learned of this and we've put a stop to it, and I was just a zealous media official and the Prime Minister was not aware of it. Baloney. John Howard ran a very tight ship.
It is not known if John Howard had anything to do with the slur on Wilkie, but critics of the Iraq invasion usually had a rough time, especially if it touched on intelligence.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
In June of 2003, CIA operative Valerie Plame had her cover blown by her own government. Her husband, the experienced diplomat Joe Wilson, had been sent to Niger to investigate claims of selling uranium to Saddam Hussein. Despite his findings, both Bush and Blair continued to state that Saddam was going nuclear. Wilson eventually wrote an article for the New York Times in which he said that Bush and Blair got it wrong. It led to an extraordinary act of vengeance in which Wilson's wife was outed as a spy. It ended her 15-year career at the CIA.
Classified status?
Yes, it did. I could no longer perform the work for which I had been highly trained. I could no longer travel overseas or do the work for which my career, which I loved. It was done.
Scooter Libby, a former assistant to President Bush and a former chief of staff for Vice President Cheney, was the official found guilty of outing Plame. He was sentenced to 30 months jail and fined $250,000, only to be pardoned by George W. Bush. Governments take national security very seriously. They take being caught lying about national security even more seriously.
I was never going to stop the Iraq War. The only person who could have stopped the Iraq War was George W. Bush. I was the last person who might have caused trouble for the establishment and for the government.
Andrew Wilkie comes from a very conservative background. He's a complex character. Like a lot of whistleblowers, he has a deep-seated sense of right and wrong.
I had a very conservative upbringing. As I grew up and went through the Catholic education system and then went into Duntroon for 5 years.
Open order!
Throughout that whole period, I was encouraged to think about right and wrong and doing the right thing. I'm very, very proud to say I'm a graduate of Duntroon. It set me up well for life. It equipped me well to forge a successful military career for 20 years.
Until shortly before he went public, Wilkie had actually lived here at Duntroon, in the heart of the military establishment, where his former wife was the commanding officer.
I reached the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the Infantry Corps. My final posting was seconded to the Office of National Assessments as the military strategic analyst in ONA.
Armies, particularly the Australian one, are built on mateship. If something goes wrong, you drink the Kool-Aid, carry on. You don't dog. It's about loyalty, flag, and nation. Andrew Wilkie was not alone in his doubts. Years later, we were to learn that many intelligence officers had their reservations, but they kept them to themselves. So to what extent does the state have the right to mislead people in a time of war? And what part should an intelligence service play in that?
Australia is an excessively secret country, especially in comparison to New Zealand, Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom.
Whether I was in government or opposition, you would have an expectation that it was not unreasonable that information ought to be in the public arena, and freedom of information laws were put in place to ensure that that could happen, but also to ensure that the broader national interest could be protected. And it's a question of how you get the balance right in relation to those issues.
While the military plotted the how, what and where of the invasion, around the world the politicians worked overtime on the why. While Howard, Bush and Blair filled our screens, the streets filled with those who were sceptical.
Perhaps the most influential protests at the time on me were the February protests around the world. In hundreds of cities, millions of people took to the streets.
Inside ONA, he had not so much an ally as an ear.
I was travelling with my then colleague, Dr. Kate Burton, throughout Indonesia and Vietnam at that time on...
International Issues Analyst. We were recruited in the same round, so we started about October 2001.
It was a journey that would last well beyond the Office of National Assessments.
Kate was a fellow traveller in more ways than one. Not only was she travelling with me throughout Southeast Asia at the time, but she had great concerns about the Iraq War. And when I think of the staff gatherings before that trip overseas and the times when analysts would debate the issue and argue among themselves about whether or not we should go to war, she was perhaps one of the most outspoken critics of the war.
Later, Andrew and Kate's friendship developed and they married. But at this stage, they were just colleagues.
Andrew was keen to protect me, I suppose, from any fallout in terms of me knowing too much about it, and I certainly started to get pretty nervous about the whole idea and what might happen, so I actually didn't really want to know too much after a certain point.
When I resigned from O&A, I acted alone. I made the decision alone. Before I made my decision, before I approached Laurie Oakes, I cut her loose. I cut her loose for her own protection. She was getting increasingly scared about the whole matter.
One lunchtime, Andrew suggested that we go for a walk to talk about it some more, and we're walking around the lake just below O&A.
There's our bench.
Our bench. It wasn't my role at all to encourage him one way or another, but what I did try and tell him, or try to encourage him to really consider, was whatever decision he made, he needed to feel okay with himself afterwards. Andrew was my friend, and I cared very much about his welfare afterwards. For all we knew, he was going to be hauled into jail for breaching the Official Secrets Act or whatever.
Andrew Wilkie had crossed the Rubicon. He had thrown away his intelligence career to campaign against the government's invasion of Iraq.
It's the kind of risk that not many people would take. He really did walk off a precipice with absolutely no idea of what would happen to him afterwards.
On March 20th, 2003, the controversial invasion started, and it was almost over before it began. It lasted just 31 days. In the months that followed, there was no sign of the reason for it all: Saddam's arsenal of weapons of mass destruction. The leaders of the coalition of the willing scrambled to save face.
The intelligence agencies have been somewhat unfairly treated over this Iraq mess, but they did better than what the government would have us believe.